But I would like to welcome you to today's MSD Public Lecture called The Ethics of Dust. And my name is Hannah Louie, and I'm a co-director of ACAHUCH, the Australian Centre for Architectural History and Urban and Cultural Heritage, along with Dean Louis Willis and Professor Philip Gove. And I'm a professor in the Faculty of ABP here at the University of Melbourne. And we begin today's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which this event is taking place, which of course may be multiple lands for everybody that's online. And I'm currently speaking from Wurundjeri land, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the place of Indigenous knowledge in the academy. And I think that that's particularly important when we're engaging in discussions around heritage. And I think we've been hoping to organise this talk with Professor Jorge Otero-Pailos for some time. I know I was thinking about it before COVID, so it's been a while. And I'm very much looking forward to today's lecture and appreciative of the flexibility of Professor Otero-Pailos in finding a time that's possible. I know that it's very late in New York for you at this time. And as we'll hear today, I think that Professor Otero-Pailos has made a profound impact on heritage and preservation thinking through his critical research, his leadership in academia, and editorship of journals such as Future Anterior. But I'm going to hand over to Dr. Stuart King, who is the Director of the Masters of Urban and Cultural Heritage here, to just formally introduce our speaker and then hand over to Jorge.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. So it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome Jorge Otero-Pailos, Professor and Director of Historic Preservation at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. He's an artist, architect and a preservationist whose works have been exhibited in major museums, foundations, galleries and international biennials. He's a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences of Puerto Rico. He's also the recipient of numerous awards from major arts organisations, including the Crest Foundation, the Graham Foundation, the Fitch Foundation, the American Institute of Architects, and the Canadian Centre for Architecture. And in 2012, received the UNESCO Eminent Professional Award. He's received the American Academy in Rome's 2021-22 Roy Lichtenstein Residency in the Visual Arts as well. As Hannah's already mentioned, he's founder and editor of the journal Future Anterior, and the author and editor of books including Architecture's Historical Turn from 2010 and Experimental Preservation from 2016, which advocates critical experimentation in what and how we conserve heritage objects and the insights that such practices bring to our understandings of past, present and future. Thank you. Over to you, Jorge.
Thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge that I am speaking from the ancestral land of the Lenni Lenape peoples, and very moved by the fact that we are speaking across space in such an effortless way, but at the same time recognizing the deep histories of the places where we're gathering together. It's really moving. And I have to say that the first time that I heard a land acknowledgement was during my visit to Australia quite some years back, and it was an eye-opening and mind-opening experience. So I've learned a lot from the amazing work that heritage professionals have been doing in Australia. And so I begin by thanking you for that, because really I wish we had more time and more opportunities to do this kind of discussion. So I want to move straight into my presentation. Thank you so much for the introduction. And for this opportunity, I'm really honored by the opportunity to be able to speak with you. I am going to be speaking about the ethics of dust, but before And please, by the way, feel free to interrupt me if you have a question, an idea, or if something doesn't work, if the presentation is not working for whatever reason. I want to start with a project that is not the ethics of dust, but I think that will lay out some themes that will help us kind of understand and frame the ethics of dust in some way. It's this project that I did with the United States Embassy in Oslo. As you know, an embassy is a group of people, a building, the building where embassies gather are called chanceries. And this was a chancery designed by Eero Saarinen in 1959, a modernist masterpiece, really. It was 40 years without a chancel. A chancel, as you know, is the Latin word for gates. A chancellor is the gatekeeper, of course. And so you can see that chancel, a fence, that wrapped around the chancery for 18 years out of its 40 years, out of its currently 58 years of existence. So 40 years without a chancel, 18 years with it. When the embassy moved out of the chancery was sold, and it was sold to a private developer who then wanted to redevelop it. And that's when I was brought in to try to think a little bit about how we preserve this building. And my argument was that this chancel, this fence that was put around the building, was really part of the building. The whole building is a chancel, and a really significant part of the history of the building. When the Norwegian heritage authorities designated the site, however, they carefully excluded that fence, which you can see around the chancery here. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor.
Yes.
You do. Okay. Well, here you can see that this is the fence going all around, and the Norwegian authorities excluded that, making the claim that it was not part of the building. It was insignificant. It was not part of the historic significance of the building. The building sits in front of the Royal Palace. This is the most prominent site in Oslo. All of the major institutions are there, cultural institutions, political institutions, and of course, the privileged spot for the American embassy, because of a very privileged relationship between the United States and Norway that forged really during the post-war, because as you know, Norway shares a border with now Russia, but then the USSR. And so the United States and Norway had a strategic relationship there for common defense and so on. Now, of course, when Norway was going to join NATO, there was a lot of anxiety about that, because people in Norway thought that that was going to provoke the USSR into invading Norway. So there were a lot of protests that happened in front of this embassy. And over time, it moved from being this very open to the street. It was never really an open building. It's actually quite dark and closed, very much like a chancel. But this chancel was put up. So there was no way to save it. This was going to come down. It was a process then that began to try to think about ways in which, how do we save this? How do we save this piece of the building? And so I staged this performance where I hired these construction machines, and we actually took the fence and began to dismantle it in front of the embassy. And so we took these machines, and then we crushed the fence. We removed it. We literally pulled it off, and in the process of removing it, began to transform it and give it a kind of form that it didn't have before, but at the same time preserving the fence itself. We didn't add anything to the fence. We didn't remove any material from the fence. We simply turned the fence in order to remove it. So this process led me to then take all of these pieces and to lay them out into a huge yard, which you can see over here. And I started to look at these pieces and try to put them back together in a way that could have a kind of aesthetic interest that was new, to try to bring new meaning to these pieces. And so I reassembled the pieces into sculptures, into new sculptures. And you can see some of the work. These are very heavy. This is solid steel. This industrial grade, military grade steel. And so we had to have cranes and a number of, expert welders that could give me a hand, to try to pull all this together. But essentially, I wanted to preserve the act of taking these fences down, and not only the fence. So the transformation, the physical transformation of the fragments had to do with also acknowledging the fact that they have been removed from the site, that they had been taken away, and that a new life was beginning for these pieces. Always related back to the embassy itself, but also future leaning. And so I gave the pieces different names of the messages and ideas that went through the fence between Norway and the United States. A series of treaties were signed. And so I took words from those treaties and gave them and used them as names. So here you see Biosignature Preservation. This is actually this was a show in London at Regent's Park for free sculpture. Now, this is interesting because this is the words are also part of the future leaning aspect of these fences. Biosignature preservation is taken from a treaty regarding the colonization of Mars, and work that the United States and Norway are doing to try to colonize Mars. And so biosignature preservation is a series of experiments that are being conducted to try to figure out whether there was ever any life on Mars, and whether that biosignature of that life remained preserved within the geological strata of the rocks on Mars. This sculpture, which is called Polar Partnership, really begins to open up a whole kind of world into the polar region as the future, in its role in our future. As you know, the ice caps are melting, and this is creating a very tense geopolitical relationship among all the polar countries. This one's called Airworthiness, which has to do with a treaty that was signed to create spaceships that will travel to Mars that are solar powered, and their airworthiness. And not solar powered like photovoltaic, but actually powered by the solar winds. So in a sense, these are sail ships that would take us, to colonize Mars. And this one's called Analog Sites, is a series of experiments that have to do with creating architectural equivalents or analogs of life on Mars. Like, how would we build an architecture on Mars? And so they have sites in Svalbard in the north of Norway and in Hawaii, where they are playing with different ways of living in a hostile environment. This one has to do with byproduct material, some ideas about how to reuse the materials that would come out of that colonization of Mars. There is another one called Holders of Traditional and Local Knowledge, which has to do with the effort to work with the Sami people of northern Norway in various efforts to try to rethink the polar region. And so these are some other smaller ones. The one in the foreground is the one that's called Holders of Traditional and Local Knowledge. But these pieces poetically both, they do many things at once. On the one hand, they are a way of preserving a very important fragment of this building, without which we would lose a very important part of the history of this building. And so here I use art as a method of heritage preservation. But in the process of saving the material, I also have transformed the pieces themselves and giving them a name. They're always going to be related to the embassy, of course, but giving them a name that is opening up or giving us a window into the future, that the long wedge that was started, let's say, in this location, and that we will see unfold in the future. And so that for me is very important, that heritage can also be a way to catch glimpses of the future. And of course, this future has to do with colonization. It has to do with the polar region, and it has to do also with data and the control of data. A lot of these sculptures have to do with communication between governments to maintain control over data. And so really what you saw there was, and now I'm going to turn to the ethics of dust more properly, but through this project, which what you saw there were a series of fragments taken from a building that are trying to, in a way, preserve an important part of that building against a condition that is not, say, open to that preservation, and against a heritage bureaucracy that doesn't recognize the importance of those elements in particular. And to some degree, what I'm doing, working with these fragments, has a very long history. And here I was just at the American Academy, and I did this piece for the American Academy in one of their walls, which is full of ancient fragments, which are pieces of buildings that were saved because they were considered really important at various times. And what I did is, if you notice the wall on the right, there is this line over here. And that line is really my work. That's what I did. The work is called, "Therefore by Bodies Unseen, Does Nature Do Its Work?" And it was a work of cleaning. I cleaned this wall. I removed the dust on this wall, and I transferred it onto a latex cast, which you can see over here. Of course, the latex is flipped backwards. So what you see on the left is the dust from that wall transferred onto that latex cast and backlit. And so what you're looking at is the clean wall over here, and this up here is the dirty wall above. The title here comes from a poem by Lucretius. Lucretius was an ancient scientist, and ancient scientists actually wrote their treatises in poetic, in verse form, which to me is amazing. It's just like, how wonderful could that be if our scientists today wrote poetry? And one of the verses, he is famous because of his observations of dust. And part of his interest in dust led him to see that the decay of stones, the decay of buildings, when sculptures that people touched over and over again began to weather without being able to perceive any people were not taking chunks, but just the act of touching was rubbing these sculptures, and they were losing their materiality. He said, how are they actually becoming smaller just by virtue of touch? The touch must be taking something away, and that something away must be an elemental form. We can't see that body. This is why he calls it bodies unseen. For him, dust was an unseen body, and that is, he believed, some kind of elemental unit of nature, which we later called the atom. He, of course, did observe dust moving in air, and he observed the movement of dust that led them to describe the kind of Brownian motion of atoms. Although he wasn't observing atoms, he was actually observing dust, but it was later taken by 20th century scientists. So there's a long history here of observing the world and observing fragments, but also that fragments can be very small. This is what I think is very interesting about Lucretius and very interesting about these traditions of taking stones from buildings, pieces from buildings. What is the right size that one should take in order to preserve the meaning, the significance of that fragment, of that architecture of that place? So here I did this these series, these multiple fragments of the American Academy in Rome, and brought them together in what I call distributed monuments. Of course, distributed monuments are the fragments, but they're also, you know, the dust itself. The dust is a fragment also. So this was both showing, you know, the tradition of using fragments and putting them on the wall, and also taking our eyes and guiding them towards attention to the small fragments that are also attached to the wall. And so, you know, I've worked on this in various ways, and worked on these little fragments that can be moved away from the side in relationship to the side. And there's a book called Distributed Monuments that you can look at to inquire further on this. But here is a very interesting piece for me, because it is the piece that really got me started thinking about what a fragment might be. And here is a fragment of one of my works. This was a piece that was cut off from one of my works. And the work itself is a work that I did. It took six years, was to really clean the dust of Westminster Hall and to transfer all the dust into these big latex sheets. And we opened the day of Brexit, so there was a lot of attention that grew around this work, and many museums wanted, you know, the piece. And finally, the decision was made to actually cut it into pieces and to distribute it among different museums. So the idea here was that the significant piece could be smaller than the actual work. And this was to me a revelation, because, you know, typically when you think about cutting up a work of art, you're basically destroying it. But actually, in this case, it was a way of amplifying it and of increasing the stories that it might be able to tell. Westminster Hall, of course, as you all know, is part of the Houses of Parliament. We all know the Houses of Parliament for Big Ben. We've all seen Westminster Hall in the last few days, because it is the place where Queen Elizabeth II has been lying in state. You can see it here. It's 1,000 years old. It's an extraordinary building. It is a building that has been a government building used for government purposes for over 1,000 years. The University of Sydney actually has a replica of this building on its campus. And attached to this building with its famous hammer beam roof is Parliament, and we'll talk about it in a second. But those walls that you see on the left, forget this stuff, because this, as you can see, is actually a fake newsstand that was built in front of the wall, and they painted it like stone. I don't know if that's clear to everyone, but these are the walls that we actually cleaned. And so this is a, you know, very important place. But for me, what was also important was this is the previous monarch lying in state in Westminster Hall in 1952. Look at the stains on that wall. That dust that you can see on that photograph, that is the dust that we pulled away from the wall, and that is the dust that you can see on this cast over here. It's a really important building because a lot of things happened there, of course, that have to do with politics. It was the court, it was the royal courts. Charles I was tried by Parliament and put to death because he tried to install a absolute monarchy. He said, well, you know, we need a modern state in the UK, and who has a modern state? The French have a modern state, and they're an absolute monarchy, so we should do the same. And of course, Parliament reminded him that his ancestors had signed the Magna Carta and that he was a traitor to the state by trying to dissolve Parliament, and we know how the story ended. He was decapitated. But of course, this idea that the ruler needs to go every so often is something that, you know, we, at least in the United States, absorbed into our notion of the presidency lasting only a very short period of time. And of course, on the floor of this place are the markers of every one of these events that happened. And here is the trial of William Wallace. On a little bit above is Queen Elizabeth II when she addressed both houses of Parliament for her Jubilee. But I was interested in what other stories can be told here, that how can we expand the significance of this site beyond the great figures and beyond the political figures? How can we include a larger discussion about our common achievements and also about our environmental impact? And here's our scaffolding. We collaborated with Parliamentary Estates. This was, you know, quite a lot of people were involved in this project. Here's some in-between shots with half cleaned, half dirty, so you can get a sense of just how much dust we pulled off. What was in this dust? There was the fire of 1834, in which basically all of what was around Westminster Hall burnt, but all the Londoners came out to try to save Westminster Hall because it meant so much to them. There was, of course, pollution from factories that were in and around London. And we know about that pollution all the way into the 19th century and certainly into the 20th century. This was the same year that King George VI lied in state. The great smog of London killed lots of people, especially the elderly and people with underlying conditions. But there were also other kinds of dust in Westminster Hall. This is the fumigation campaign done by preservationists, done by heritage professionals in 1971 to try to get rid of the beetle that is inside, or that was inside of the hammer beam roof, the oak hammer beam roof. It's called the Death Watch beetle because, of course, it sits above the monarchs and watches the lying in state. And so part of that dust was also embedded in the walls. And that's what for me is very interesting, this idea that the dust that is contained in these sheets actually begins to point us in the direction of a larger environmental history, a larger sets of stories of how we relate to our environment, how we are relating to other species, and how we also understand what architecture is. Because, of course, the big question is, does all this dust belong to the architecture, or is it extrinsic to the architecture? Is this like the fence in Oslo? Does it belong to the heritage building, or should we exclude it? But of course, part of what you realize when you really begin to move this dust away from the building is that you start focusing on it and its history, and you realize that you couldn't have architecture without it. Look at all the boilers over here in Chicago spewing smog to heat these buildings. This is Pittsburgh, the Smoky City. It looked like midnight in the morning. This is, you know, you're having lunch right now. This is lunchtime in 1945. It looks like midnight. And so why? Because this was the place where all the steel was produced. This was where all this architecture was being produced for New York City and all the other major metropolises. Had a big impact on people. And of course, the minute that the industry died down after World War II and the collapse of industrial work led to a post-industrial society, first thing that we did was to clean all these buildings. And this, of course, coincides with the rise of preservation as a profession. This cleaning of facades became the bread and butter of the burgeoning post-war profession of historic preservation. And all of that dust was removed and flushed into the Great Lakes, flushed into rivers. It it was made to look as if it had disappeared, but in fact, all we did was to move it around. And so for me, it was very important to, in a sense, acknowledge the central role that pollution has played in our civilization. And I had this opportunity to do a work for the Victoria and Albert Museum in relationship to their historic collection. And I decided to work on their largest object, which is a copy of Trajan's Column. You can see that picture on the left. Trajan's Column is in Rome. It is a first century BC monument. And already by the mid-19th century, archaeologists, historians had realized that the famous bas-relief of Trajan's war against the Dacians was losing its integrity because of the sulfuric rain that was on top of Rome. And so what did they do? They made a copy to try to preserve it and move it off site. And one of those copies went to the V&A. And for me, what was astonishing was that the copy was wrapped around a chimney, and they hired the same folks that were building industrial chimneys to build this copy. And so this copy was put up in 1872. And here you have a painting of London, just to put ourselves into the moment of 1875. And on the bottom right-hand corner is a zoom into that into that painting. And you can see very clearly all of the chimneys that are making smoke in the city of London. And what on first glance looks like a very, clean sky, when you look closely, you realize that the artist, James Webb, is picking up on a haze that is hovering above London. And when you read John Ruskin, who was one of the founders, as you all know, of our, modern conservation movement, he writes that the last pure weather above London was 1876. So that he said, up until then, London, okay, there was smoke on top of London, but above London, there was clean air. But after that date, even the atmosphere above London was polluted. So what I did was to go into this column, because the column had actually collected all of this dust from the museum, because the museum had its windows open. The museum had, didn't have air conditioning, so all the windows were open and all of the smoke was coming inside. And this inside the column was hollow, and it was never cleaned. And so the keeper of sculpture kindly gave me permission to clean the inside of the sculpture. And we applied a latex poultice. And as the poultice dries, it absorbs all of the dust. And because the water can only evaporate in one direction, so that direction makes it pull out. And so then the latex absorbs all of that dust, and as it dries, then also creates a mold of the wall in which it sits. So here you can see that mold, and this is the final result. On the left, here is my installation with the latex, and you can see all of the dust of that brick, and this is the column from where that latex came. So right sitting next to it. And for me, it was very important to put it in this room, because this room was the poor man's grand tour. If you didn't have money to make it to Rome, to go to Germany, to go on to Spain or to Italy, you actually went in this room and you could see the great monuments of Western culture all in one room. But of course, what was missing from this is that we couldn't have all these monuments without making a ton of pollution. And so we've been ignoring pollution. And part of what we can, part of the challenge is to begin to try to think about pollution as part of our culture. How do we deal with it instead of negating it and acting as if it is not there? Introducing dust in this room for me was a way of beginning that conversation. And of course, that conversation has been around for a while, because once you start getting interested in dust, you see it everywhere. And here you have Art History 101, if you've taken Art History 101, you've been shown this painting, Joshua Bathers Aranier, the beginning of pointillism, the beginning of a new way of seeing the world, a new kind of breaking up of form. And what do you see in the back of that painting? Chimney stacks and smoke coming out of those chimney stacks. And so for me, I can't look at this painting and I can't look at the idea of seeing form breaking up without acknowledging the fact that the air through which 19th century painters were looking was actually polluted. And a lot of those effects were actually how you saw things. They were maybe a little bit more blurry. They were a little bit hidden in a kind of veil. And you can see some of the pictures of Monet are also, they really emphasize this. But I got interested in those chimney stacks and in that painting because of this commission to work on an artwork for Louis Vuitton's museum in Paris. And those chimney stacks that you saw in the painting, one of those, we don't know which one exactly, was this chimney stack of Louis Vuitton. And here you have it. On the right is his factory. On the left is his home. And I proposed to clean the facade of his home because that chimney stack would have put all of that dust right on top of him. And between was a road, and this road was where all the materials came and went from the factory. So leather and wood would come in, and then, the big bags and steamer trunks would come out. Of course, when LVMH bought the house, they did a cleaning in the 1990s, so there wasn't a lot of dust. But actually, when, as a heritage professional, you learn to look at buildings for different changes that have happened, right? And so here you can see the yellow brick, and this brick is just a little bit more reddish. And as it turned out, they actually added this whole piece to make a kind of lean-to addition where they could store the garbage out of sight. And so we went into that room, and lo and behold, that room had not been cleaned, and we could find in the garbage room of the Louis Vuitton house the original pollution from the Louis Vuitton factory. And so on the entrance of the Louis Vuitton Museum, in rather a bold curatorial statement, was presented this, this sheet of pollution next to the portrait of Mr. Louis Vuitton, which you can see over here, and his famous steamer trunks, which were the ones that enabled people to move their goods from Europe to Australia, to Africa, to the Americas, in many ways enabled the colonization of faraway places from Europe. So this was a very interesting history about the movement of materials and the movement of various sorts of materials around the world and the politics around them. And of course, dust, we know, is related to acid rain. They're not the same thing. The gases, the sulfuric rain has to do with some of the gases. The dust is really often fly ash, the remains of fuel that has not been fully burned. But acid rain has a tremendous impact on architecture, and especially on stone. And artists have been observing these impacts for a very long time. One of the early preservationists of the 19th century was a chemist who worked in Manchester, and who actually noticed that he was a member of the Scottish Preservation Society, Antiquarian Society, and noticed that the bricks of the buildings and the mortar between the buildings was actually falling off. This was in the 1860s. His name was Robert Angus Smith, and he wrote a book from these observations that is called Towards a Chemical Climatology, and is considered one of the early works of understanding the effects of human-created climate change. So he's considered one of the first environmentalists. And he was a heritage preservationist. So after him, people like Sir Richmond, who was actually a student of Ruskin and William Morris, and a stained glass artist, realized that his stained glass windows didn't get any sun from the other side because of polluted skies. And so he started the Smoke Abatement Society in 1898. This became the first organized environmentalist group in the UK. Later, it was the group that advocated for the Clean Air Act in the UK, and it inspired the Clean Air Act in the United States as well. But look at 1898 at this caricature. Look at the bottom. He's mocked as being a marionette. What is he going to do with this sword? You know, I mean, it looks like a knight in shining armor, but King Cole doesn't care. His sword is going to go right through the smoke and nothing's going to happen. But actually, this caricaturist was wrong. Things did happen, but it took 60 years. And Sir Richmond did not see the effects of his advocacy work. But he did come to that by learning to look closely at things. And this was a lesson and a methodology that seems simple enough, but it's not. A lesson that he learned from John Ruskin, and a lesson that I learned from John Ruskin, and a lesson that I think everyone should learn from John Ruskin is look closely. Observe these buildings, because when you do, you see the manner of their decay. And so on the left, you can see John Ruskin's and Hobbes's daguerreotype of the Doge's Palace, a building that he was obsessed with because, of course, Venice was a naval empire, and he lived in a country that was trying to become a naval empire as well. And so he thought that naval empire should model itself on Venice and not in Rome. The Romans were not very good at naval warfare. They were great on land. And he said, you know, we should be neo-Gothic and we have a ton of Gothic architecture in the UK. So that should be our architecture. But look at the building now and look at the building in 1990. It's been constantly clean. It's been cleaned and over cleaned. And here you have it on towards the facade of St. Mark's Square. It is power washed at least every 20 years, if not more often. And every time it's power washed, a lot of that stone is dissolved. And so what they've taken to do now is that they're taking the pieces of the building and removing them from the building. So the capitals of the building have been removed, and they are put underneath the building right here in what's called the Museum of the Building. So the building is in a way ingesting itself, and then they're putting replicas of those original pieces. But what happens when you take a piece off the building? So I said, okay, we found the last wall that had never been cleaned because it's out of the sight of all of the tourists. So what happens when we take that and we remove the dust and we put it in front of the wall, or we move it away from the wall into a new space? I was very interested in the story that it can give us. And so I said, can we put this dust that we just removed also as part of the museum of the building, because it belongs to the building? And of course I was laughed away, and they said, no, there's no way you can do that. It doesn't belong to the building. But we discovered some very interesting things in the process. And I don't know if you can see this very clearly, but you see these lines over here, these black lines? Yeah, can you guys? Okay. So those coincide with the mortar lines. And clearly at some point, the mortar had fallen off, and some crafty preservationists had gone in and put new mortar and painted it over to match the color of the existing wall with black. And so I consulted some of my colleagues in Venice, and I said, how can this be? Somebody was already kind of painting this black, and they said, well, that's nothing. There was this whole tradition of painting whole buildings black. In fact, all of St. Mark's Square was painted black because when British tourists would come, they thought that it didn't look old enough because they were used to a black London. And so they painted the whole buildings black to make them look older to please British tourists. Now the British tourists want the buildings to look very clean. And so we have this whole way in which we manipulate heritage to make it meet our expectations of what we think the past should look like. But on also this notion that if we paint buildings to look like they're polluted, that's considered important and worth preserving. And if you go to St. Mark's Square, they still have all those painted facades. But if it came from the sky, then it's not considered important. So this is something that for me was important to begin to raise the question, to enact this question. And here's a project that I did in a building that was built by Mussolini in the north of Italy, in an area that was formerly the Austria and was lost by Austria during World War I and became part of Italy. And they still speak German in this area. So there's a lot of tension there because Mussolini built this factory to bring workers from the south to work here and Italianize the north. And this was very antagonistic to the local population. And so they didn't like this building. And the first moment they had opportunity, they tore it down, but a piece of it was preserved and the main machine hall was preserved, but it was just being completely cleaned out. So what I did was I actually cleaned one of the last remaining walls, which is the end of the machine hall. And you can see here, this is the factory clock. And this is the big project. This just came down. It was just reinstalled in the Museum of Bolzano, which is where this is in the north of Italy. It was up all this year, just until this Sunday. This is a little detail of that. So this idea of dust and moving something away from a place and of circulation and of the way that we relate to things really led me to various investigations. And one of them was I learned stuff from each of these projects. I have to say, I don't kind of know what I'm getting into when I start a project. I sometimes work very intuitively and through design and through art, which is quite unlike the traditional, conservation plan methodology where, you spend 1 year in the library doing research and then you figure out what the values are and then you develop the policies and then you tell people what the policy is. I work very differently. I work almost in a reverse way. I begin with what you do, and through what you do, you begin to raise questions. And so here in this project, this was a commission by a museum in San Francisco, California. I worked on the U.S. Mint. The U.S. Mint, this is where all of the gold from the gold rush came through this building. It was turned into money in this building, and it was turned into money through the heat that came out of those two chimneys that you can see there. And the whole building's been cleaned, but actually between the top and the attic of this building, we found some original pollution. And so this is the chimney as it goes through the attic, and you can see how dark it is. You can see how black and stained those walls are. And this is those two chimneys made into were the attic, from the attic, made into these two rooms where you can actually go in and experience the dust that was made. And here, it wasn't just made to make architecture. This was made to make money. All of the money, at one point, a third of the money of the United States was in this building. It was built so well that the picture I showed you earlier, everything around it is a ruin because they had just gone through an earthquake. But this building resisted all of that and survived it. And so here in these rooms, you can kind of look into and peer into the residue of building an economy and the extractive nature of that very act of simply producing a coin, of producing money. And of course, the more money that we had, the more people we could host, the larger the economy could be. So the amount of coins in the economy was relative to the amount of people in the United States was a growing population. And now everybody, the dollar is the world coin. So how did we make so much money, right? Well, we made paper, and now we've moved to the digital realm. So I think that, this really started to make me think about the relationship between the economy and the environment, the materiality of the economy. And it also made me think about what happens when I take that dust from the original building, from the heritage site into the museum. That is an artistic move. And I was very inspired by somebody, by an artist from the 1960s called Robert Smithson, who did this show. I became familiar with this show because I went to this university. It was, Cornell University. It was the first Earth Art show. One of the assistants to this exhibition was Gordon Matta Clark, who was another influence for me. This was very present when I was going through school. And what Smithson did was to take salt from the lake, because there's a salt mine under the lake, and to move it into the gallery and make a pile out of it in the gallery. This was the beginning for him of what he later called site non-site. And to be rather reductive, one of the ideas that Smithson put forward is that in those displacements, there is a very particular kind of meaning making. It's bringing an understanding of a site that didn't have an understanding before, that was maybe nondescript, like a mine, culturally nondescript. And by moving a piece of it away into a different artistic context, you can create and you can enable a new kind of reading and a new kind of interpretation of that site, perhaps a forward-looking interpretation of that site, a kind of imagination of what it could be. And so this site and non-site was very important for me. And also, Eva Hesse's work, of course, has been very important to me. And her work with latex really was very inspirational for me. One of the reasons why I started to work with latex to clean buildings was because of Eva Hesse. She was making art, but I was interested in using that art to try to care for the thing that was being treated with the latex. And so I want to end with a project that was very much inspired by this famous work of Eva Hesse, Contingent, and you'll see it very, very soon. This is a work that I did in an ancient Roman mine in Spain. It was a silver mine. It actually chronologically came before that other project in San Francisco, which was also about money. But this is the silver mine where the Romans, Romans defeated the Carthaginians because the Carthaginians had one of the largest silver mines in the Mediterranean. It was in Spain. It's now Spain. And so they took a very long time. They fought the Punic Wars to try to get to that silver because they needed to grow their empire. And in order to grow their empire, they needed to subsume people into their economy, which meant that they needed more coins. And so they needed more silver. And so these are, you can see the relationships here to Eva Hesse's work. These are actually casts of that mine, but I hung them from cables that are tied to these chains, and those chains are what miners use to go down into the mine. They put their belongings up on the ceiling and they put a lock on it when they go down. And so this was actually exhibited in Sydney at the Tin Sheds Gallery in a show that was about the extractive nature of industry, about coal mining in Australia, and the relationship between that mine and Spain. Was opening up a different kind of conversation for me, because as it turned out, the dust that we had in those pieces, you can find the same dust in the North Pole. And so that is quite phenomenal because it's a very long way from Spain to the North Pole, but it's an even longer way if you think about the way that the trade winds move. You actually have to go from Spain to the Americas and back up to the North Pole. So in fact, the Romans had polluted the world's atmosphere, and they had done so with an empire that was 70 million people. And now we're close to 8 billion people. So the scale differential is just so enormous that to begin to understand the way that we are polluting is really to begin to try to understand this great work of art that we're making all around us, which is the atmosphere. And that atmosphere really requires our care now. We all realize that it is for us to really take care of. The best idea that people have is to try to turn it back to its previous state, to an earlier date, which is the most basic and outmoded idea of historic preservation. So can we as preservationists think more creatively and with more future leaning about how do we care for this monument that is going to be around for a very long time, which is the atmosphere and the world around us, floating around us. So I invite you to think about it together but what that means, of course, is to move heritage away from, let's say, necessarily a connection to land and more connected to air, and to begin our understanding of sight from the sky down rather than from the land up. But maybe I will stop there, and because I know we're tight on time, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. And I know how hard these Zoom talks can be, and so I really appreciate the attention that you've given me and the time you've given me. So thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. It's a real treat, I think, to hear about that series of incredible projects and so refreshing and I think a very radical way of rethinking how we approach preservation and heritage, which has been, part of your work. And I think it comes at a time with us here, just like everywhere else, where trying to rethink how we engage with the history of architecture and urban history through this lens of the impact of energy, production, consumption of energy, of fossil fuels. And so your work sort of has found a way of bearing witness to that history, which I think is incredibly interesting. Now we've got a few minutes for questions. I might jump in just with one quick question and then we'll see what other questions there are. But you talked a little bit at the very beginning in the Oslo project about where you had pictures of yourself being involved in that project, and at every one of those projects is sort of, I guess that act of cleaning seems to be quite an important thing for your work, the performative aspect of that, and that through that sort of gesture of maintenance, you're looking closely in a sort of Ruskinian way that you're talking about. And I'm just sort of wondering if you could talk about that a little more, particularly for students, I think, to sort of, it's a way of finding yourself into thinking through doing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. It's very important for me to be hands-on, because if anything, being on a site working just allows you not to answer email for like a month, and that just clears the mind, and it's a bit, meditative. You just are able to be there with the monument doing work on it, and really that's why I say, sometimes I work very intuitively, and I just allow myself to sit with that place, and then things come up and ideas come up, and how I want to respond to that site. It's very tricky because, it's very hard for a manager, because all these sites have, heritage managers. And of course, everybody's very anxious about what am I going to do with our site, And so that takes a lot of tact and just building trust and knowing that I'm there to care for the monument, that's my top priority. But that time spent there for me is really critical. And you also just start dialogues with the people that live there and engage with them in a different, and learn a ton from them. It's a different kind of community engagement than, let's say, a sociologist might do, but it is a bit like being there. And I think none of these projects would really been possible for me if I had not been there, And by the way, I gave you my interpretation of those sites and those works, but it's just one among many, right? I recognize that what a work of art can do, first of all, is to preserve that material. I mean, is to enable the preservation of the materiality, but in a form that allows for a different kind of intellectual engagement and a different kind of opening up of connections that is less path determined than the typical scholarship that is done. And so it allows for more lateral connections. And so quite literally moving the dust laterally away from the wall, already just allowed me to think about it. Well, now it's sitting in the middle of the air, like, oh, duh, it came from the air, there's some very obvious things that it took me a very long time to get to, I have to say. I'm kind of ashamed to say it, but it took me a long time to even start thinking of that dust as somewhere between the atmosphere and the building. And I had to resist the idea that it's either or, right? That the building is the building and the air is the air, right? And to try to understand that there are materials that are both, and dust is one of them, took me a long time.
Yeah. Questions. How do we manage questions from the room or digital? Let's see if anyone's got a quick question in the room.
Can I ask a quick question?
You can.
About the latex. It appears to be extraordinarily translucent. So when you display it in a gallery setting, are you also having to introduce a whole new series of lights to get, your photographs are beautiful. So how is there enormous amount of work done with lighting?
Yeah. So actually, I learned something from every work. One of the first works I did was that one in the Italian factory. And it was in front of a big window and the sun came in, and lo and behold, the latex lit up. And I had no idea, because I'd been working with the latex in the lab. We have a preservation technology lab, and I was applying latex to more sculptural pieces, and it looks kind of milky, but it's an incredible material. When light hits it, it turns gold. And that was a discovery that was accidental. But once I saw it, I'm like, we need to replicate this. How do we get the light? And so then I started using artificial light. And it does create a different kind of experience. It literally brings to light the dust. And so that was a bit of an accident, but now it's really become part of the work. So, a lot of these pieces, when they're reinstalled, there'll be an artificial light put on them. And that, for me, is very much part of the work.
I think we're only going to take questions from in the room. It's a little tricky with the online because I can't see them. Anyone got a question? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I also have a question about the latex, quite a pragmatic question, but how robust are those skins that you produce?
Robust, what do you mean by robust? They work very well in tension. So they have a lot of tensile strength. That's why you can pull them off the wall and they will pull the dust off and not rip.
Well, I guess I'm asking whether they need to be preserved in a particular way themselves, or are they sort of preserved and will live on in perpetuity?
Yeah, so latex is an organic material, and it has to, in order for it to last, it has to be treated like paper. So, you know, it is essentially the sap of a tree. So if you put it under ultraviolet light and you wet it and dry it and wet it and dry it, it will, you know, decompose very quickly. It has a bad reputation, latex, because of the work of Eva Hesse. There's currently a show at the Guggenheim where they're showing Eva Hesse's expanded expansion, which is from the 1960s, so it's about, you know, 60 some years old, and it has changed color. Yeah, it was very poorly taken care of. So, you know, a work that is better taken care of can last a lot longer. But for me, the decay is part of the work. You know, the fact that this is a work that in a sense acknowledges the temporality that goes with every art object, you know, that is part of the work, that also for me adds value to the moment in which you are encountering the work, because you know it's not going to be there forever. And or at least I mean, those of us that work in heritage know that nothing's going to be there forever. But many people kind of look at art and just don't even think of the fact that it's a miracle that that thing is in front of them, and there is no guarantee it'll be there tomorrow, and it is constantly decaying. Most of the Renaissance stuff that you see in museums is so overpainted that you're really looking at, you know, 19th, 20th century works, but we like to think of them as Renaissance paintings. They don't even have the original canvas behind them, most of them. You know, they've been transferred onto new canvases and so on. So I think that these works, in their fragility, and I'm very interested in that fragility, kind of acknowledge the, you know, the temporality that is part of a work of heritage. You know, so I'm for me, it's part of the work that it will change color, that it will, you know, it'll just be different the next time you see it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does that help answer your question? I'm not sure that that's what you were getting at.
That's exactly what I was getting at.
Now I have been texted a few questions, but I think we might hold those over actually and not go, because I'm aware that it is well past midnight for you. And I'm incredibly lucid for that time of day. But Theo, is that okay if we don't engage in the online questions? But and I think this has been recorded, so we can certainly engage with it that way. But just to join me again in thanking you for such a terrific talk today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's great. Appreciate it. Thank you. I hope we'll get to visit in person someday.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.